Herzlich willkommen bei Klinisch Relevant, deinem Wissenspartner für das Gesundheitswesen. 3-mal pro Woche, nämlich dienstags, donnerstags und samstags, versorgen wir dich mit unserem Podcast und bringen dir Fachwissen in deine klinische Praxis. Weitere Informationen und Angebote findest du auf unserer Webseite www.klinisch-relevant.de. Heute hörst du einen Podcastbeitrag in englischer Sprache zum Thema Social Loneliness. Dein Host ist Reynolds. Viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Klinisch Relevant in English. I'm your host, Laura Reynolds, and I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Verena Graupmann. Dr. Graupmann is an associate professor of psychology at DePaul University's College of Science and Health in Chicago. Originally from Munich, Germany, she received her PhD from the University of Sussex, UK in 2009, did a postdoctoral work at the University of Salzburg in Austria, and at the University of Munich in Germany with Habilitation in 2014. Her teaching and research are in the fields of social and cultural psychology. Her research focuses on how people respond to threats to central self-motives across cultures and how reducing perceptions of threat can reduce resistance to change and increase well-being. Specifically, she is interested in how people deal with freedom restrictions, social exclusion, cognitive dissonance, and threats to self-continuity in different contexts, including the perception of art and in relation to culturally determined self-definitions. She teaches social psychology and cultural psychology with an approach of guiding students to integrate course content, their lived experience, and current societal issues. Thank you so much for coming on and having a chat to me today. And I believe we are going to be chatting about exclusion. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation to the podcast and for the introduction. And I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a bit about exclusion and your work in that area?
Yeah, so I study, as you have said in the introduction, my broad interest is threat to the self. And one of the threats that I'm interested in is threat to belonging. And from setting out to realizing that was a broader theme that I was interested in my research, and that kind of came out as a focus for me, I realized that one way of looking at threat is through social exclusion paradigms and social psychology, because it's such a ubiquitous threat that even in a small dose, people will have a reaction. And so this is something, it's meaningful. Everybody has experienced exclusion in one form or another, and we experience exclusion in micro exclusions every day, and we're all managing those. So it's become something that I find meaningful, but it's also something that's relatively straightforward to study, either through asking people about their experiences with it, or it's relatively easy also to create moments of exclusion in the laboratory. There's a paradigm, it's called cyberball, where people, and it sounds really trivial, people will play a game of ball on the computer screen. They see a little representation of a hand, that's them, and then to both sides of the screen, there's little icons of other people that are just like a very basic drawing. They oftentimes don't know who they're playing against, and it's set up that in one condition, you get the ball in that game, that you press the mouse button to throw the ball 30% of the time, or you get it 3 times, I think, in the beginning, and then you never get the ball again. And these other 2 icons keep passing the ball back and forth. So it's a very simple representation of social exclusion. But when people play that game, we know through now, almost, I think, 3 decades of research that it impacts how they feel about their self-esteem, sense of belonging, how they feel about the sense of control they have and the meaning. So it's what we call in social psychology a minimal paradigm, because it's such a small instance of exclusion. You don't even know who you're playing against. You're on the computer screen. It's not really meaningful, but it still impacts us because we are so sensitive to being excluded as human beings that even these small instances make us feel something. And of course, that's not necessarily ruin anybody's day, but it's just to show we pay attention to this and it impacts us when it happens.
Mm. Yeah, very interesting. I read, you sent me some papers in preparation for this, and it was very interesting. I found it quite interesting, exclusion in terms of different cultural backgrounds. And I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so we were really interested in understanding how exclusion relates to sense of self in different contexts, because the way that we study exclusion in the mainstream literature researcher, it's very clear that it impacts the self, since we look at self-esteem when people experience exclusion. And there are, depending on where the culture that surrounds us, our sense of self works in different ways, because in some cultures, it's very important to connect with the people around you and to maintain this functioning social network in a way that is especially important for the family. And then and this is what we find a lot in cultures that are in East Asia. We also found it more in the southern hemispheres, or in it's more so the case in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. There's this idea that there's more emphasis on family and friendship relations and a social network, whereas we have more of a tendency to be more independent and individualistic in Europe, more going towards the north. In North America, the U.S. is a country that is strongly identified by individualism, and it's really important to mention that this is not like one or the other. In everywhere we are, individuals show both independence and interdependence, and having a really strong emphasis on social connections and being really independent. But the overall way that the culture works has these tendencies. And so broadly, people will talk about individualism and collectivism. It's always a mix, but we can see that in the mainstream culture, it actually has an impact on how we think about ourselves and others, depending on the culture that we've grown up in. And we think about these broad cultural tendencies in psychology as kind of being internalized, and how we define sense of self and how we connect to others, and where we see the important parts of who we are. Are those the parts that we that are essentially our own person, independent of others, or is it through the connections that we have with others? And so we were really interested how that would play out in situations where we experience exclusion. So we ran a number of studies in different cultures in Germany and Austria, which are more individualistic, and also in the US, and also in Taiwan and in China. And I think we even had a study that we ran in Africa. And in those studies, we saw that even though it's very similar to in individualistic countries, more individualistic countries respond and identify these minimal instances of exclusion in these paradigms that we use. However, it didn't impact sense of self to the same extent. And that was really interesting to see, because we realized that the type of exclusion that we're looking at in these studies that is identified as exclusion is more meaningful when sense of self is more independent, because then being excluded, you're basically stuck with that by yourself, as opposed to seeing that's just one aspect of social life, but you have all of these other social connections that make up who you are. So it's just not as threatening. This is how we theorize it. And then we ran a couple of studies to kind of get us closer to this mechanism, that it really has something to do with, in an individual sense of self that's very individualistic, gets more easily destabilized by such a single episode of exclusion, especially. And as I said, the exclusion that we use in the literature is oftentimes a minimal paradigm, a paradigm where we really just want to show even a small dose of this has an impact. And that's where it comes to show that that is more impactful for a sense of self in an individualistic surrounding, and for someone who identifies as more independent, than when people think of their sense of self as being more connected to their social surroundings and their important relationships.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because you did some studies also during COVID, which I suppose was like this the biggest exclusion that I could think of anyway. And did you also do that across cultures, and how did that work out?
We did, and this was more like, we weren't necessarily looking for like really cross-cultural study. That wasn't the focus of the study. But we had the chance to collect data in the US and in Germany, my collaborator being in Germany. And we were really interested in this type of exclusion that was what we called social isolation, where we weren't necessarily, nobody individually said, you can't, I don't want to see you. It was this collective experience that we need to stay like within this like small pod of either like by ourselves or with our immediate family, and not being in our usual social compositions, meeting people in all kinds of ways every day. And we were really interested how that compares to the type of social exclusion that we often study in the lab, or that's defined as ostracism, where we have this intentional aspect to the exclusion where someone basically rejects us or doesn't let us be part of something. And that has something to do with who we are, whereas the social isolation during COVID, that has nothing to do with the individual person. It had something to do with the larger situation. So we looked at that. We compared people who were experiencing several different types of degrees of social isolation and compared that in the US and in Germany. And what we found was really interesting, that even the social isolation during COVID, even though that wasn't like intended to didn't have any message about the individual person in it that could be threatening, people had a response that was kind of in between what we usually find when we study this in the lab with an exclusion situation as compared to what people expect is inclusion, where we have these needs that I've described: self-esteem, need for belonging, sense of control, meaningful life. All of those are basically at this like level that's, like people are feeling those, seeing those as fulfilled when they're included. When they're excluded, those are not fulfilled to the same extent. And our sample fell basically right in between those values, saying that there was definitely a light sense of feeling excluded, and people were experiencing that in those self-related needs. So that was really interesting to us to see, that even though it's not the exclusion that we usually think about, people experience the lack of connection as something that impacted their sense of self.
Okay. And as in this exclusion, does this like overlap with, social isolation and loneliness?
That's really interesting. And I have to admit that this is something that my research definitely relates to, but it's not exactly what I study. There's a lot of colleagues of mine in the ostracism, social exclusion area that look into this longer term social exclusion, what happens when people experience this chronically, and being excluded, being ostracized, being isolated and by themselves is a long-term state. I think what's really important to know about this is that from the research on social exclusion and the theories around it that relate to this idea that as humans, we have evolved to be around others. And that's part of our survival depends on having meaningful relationships with others that will protect us, that will help us solve problems. And so the sensitivity to exclusion is we theorize that being linked to that it's so important to us, and we're so good at detecting exclusion, if it's meaningful or not, but it's like this, almost like this early detection system, because we want to make sure that we can remedy it in some way. So the idea that somebody is excluded in the long run, it makes a lot of sense that has consequences that are pretty far-reaching and lead to longer-term consequences of, like, we know there's health-related impact of being isolated and being chronically excluded and being alone. And people draw the connection to, because it's a basic human function to look for connection and to be connected. This is how we live. And so having that need not met has long-term consequences that are related to, I know there's especially when it comes to older adults, there's obviously also a connection to memory function and the way that anything dementia-related will play out when there isn't that activation through a social connection on a daily basis.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you touched on this because I also want to touch on this, but in a minute. First, I do have a burning question. Exclusion, is there an intentional component to that versus maybe social isolation, which is, I think, defined as just having lack of social contacts, which could be, as you mentioned, for example, the older adult. I'm no longer mobile. I have my health issues. I can't get out. Probably a lot of my, close friends and family, they're maybe dead or also unwell. And that's not necessarily an intentional thing, but you just don't have the social context. Whereas is exclusion, is that subjective and a feeling of being like intentionally left out, or can you comment on that?
That is a great question. So from what we've done from what I know from the research that I've done and what's in the literature, there is definitely this distinction. So it feels, we've recently done a couple of studies on like people being in the situation where the exclusion is kind of ambiguous, and it could be intentional or it could be unintentional. But when it's made clear that it's unintentional, we still see an effect on how people feel about themselves. But we always have a stronger impact when there is this intention. And I think this really speaks to the sense of, if you understand the intention, there's something you can do about it. You can change that for the future. And there's something, that might activate you to do something different or to like seek a different group. Whereas I think if it is something that is less controllable, and if we like try to think about how that relates to like, what does it mean? Like, how can you help people who are in the situation where there's actually, it's not about who they try to connect to. It's not about how they're making these connections. It's more about their situation that kind of confines them to being isolated. Potentially, like one way in which to think about that is that there is like, it might be really important to focus on this idea that nobody is actually excluding them, but that there is something about the situation that makes it hard, and then ideally finding ways to remedy that situation and finding ways to connect, even though the situation is prohibiting that. But I think this negative self message that is inherent in the social exclusion that's often studied, and that is really important to understand also because it is really harmful, especially when it happens frequently. I think that is not the case when people are isolated in that way. And that could be also be seen as a resource in terms of trying to make sense of it and trying to get meaning from it and also finding ways around it. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, super fascinating. I love it. Yeah, I did want to talk a bit about social isolation and loneliness, if that's okay, because I'll bring in a medical focus here as well.
Okay.
So, as you mentioned, like loneliness, social exclusion impacts on self-esteem, which is obviously, psychological, how we're thinking about ourselves. So loneliness, which is the subjective feeling of being alone. So whether you're around a lot of people or have a lot of social contacts, is still this negative feeling. And then social isolation, as I mentioned, it's a lack of social connections. And I feel like from what you've been talking about, it's kind of obvious that loneliness is associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. But I think what's I find super interesting is both social isolation and loneliness are also risk factors for heart disease and increased risk of stroke, increased risk of dementia, increased risk of premature death, which rivals smoking, obesity, and physical activity. So from a medical perspective, we screen for these things. We talk about the cardiovascular risk factors and, does a person smoke? Are they obese? Physical inactivity, and we try to optimize the cardiovascular risk factors. But I suppose the thought is, do we screen for loneliness or social isolation? Knowing now, the US Surgeon General has a publication. It's called the Epidemic of Social Isolation and Loneliness, I believe. Yes, exactly. Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation 2023, where he has compared being lonely or socially isolated as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. I think that from a doctor's perspective, that is insane. And definitely, as the WHO calls it, a often forgotten but very important social determinant of health. And there are actually measurements for it, which, because people are like, oh yeah, that's so wishy-washy, whatever. But there is a Berkman-Syme Social Network Index, which is an 11-question questionnaire for measuring social isolation, and a 3-item UCLA loneliness scale for measuring loneliness. And I can pop them both in the show notes. But just for people listening, maybe that could be something you could add into your practice. If you have maybe especially older people who are multimorbid and you're trying to optimize their cardiovascular risk factors, or you're trying to see how else can you help them, that might be something you can screen for. And I think there are community programs that can help. You can, there's like day nursing initiatives. There are, I'm not really sure now in Germany, which is bad, but I know in Ireland there's like age action, and there's like groups of elderly people who meet up, and I think they were learning back in my day in university, learning how to use mobile phones and such. But yeah, I think it's definitely super interesting. So from your work, from the social psychology point of view, to it literally is something that can be translated into medicine, into people's lives. It's affecting their health, affecting their, like their mental state as well, the risk of dementia. It's, I think it's really important.
Yeah. I think this is something that needs to be taken seriously. And I think from the level that I study it, it becomes very clear it's something that runs very deeply. And when I was emphasizing these minimal paradigms, it's really to say, this is something that we don't need much. It's going to affect us. And that's for a good reason. We always, in psychology, we always want to understand, why is this a thing? Why do we have a response to this? And there's usually a reason, because it benefits us. And when we are in these situations where we don't receive this benefit of being included and having these connections, it makes a lot of sense that a lot of what our entire system is doing and relies upon and uses to navigate our organism through the world that we're in, that there's lots of ways in which that doesn't work anymore in the way as it should. And I think it's really important and crucial, and a good thing that medicine has become aware of this and frames it as an epidemic, because of course it has a lot to do with the ways that we live, and how families live together, and how we think of old age, and how families relate to older family members, and what it means to live by yourself, and thinking about different models of how intergenerational living used to be much more of a standard maybe 50 years ago, say in Germany, and it's definitely not on the rise, but more in the decline. And I wonder if these models will change once we realize how much of a public health issue that is becoming as society is aging. And we see the resources getting more scarce in how we can take care of our aging society. So I think that's having an understanding of how just providing connection, providing social interaction, and I'm sure that, there's so many ways in which that can be done that is, mutual beneficial, that's going to be a big lever to have in trying to solve a lot of these problems. Yeah. So I think making that connection has been overdue, and it's great to see that awareness of it. And I definitely see from understanding the phenomenon on the level that I'm studying it of course, like, it makes sense that it translates so directly into health issues.
Yeah. I found it interesting. There is a study which was done here in Germany in 2023. It was done by the Cologne Center for Ethics, Rights, Economics and Social Health Sciences, and it was called Loneliness in the Extreme Elderly. So they recruited 10,000 people over the age of 80 and asked them, do they feel lonely? Well, I think they probably asked them better than that, but they asked them about loneliness and social isolation. And very interestingly, because kind of I read everywhere, loneliness, this epidemic, especially elderly people, they said only 12% were lonely. So they were saying, like, German elderly people are not that lonely. And of those who were lonely, it's actually concentrated in the extreme elderly, so those over 90. And I found this interesting because one of the studies you did, and it was about this, the cultural backgrounds and this collectivistic cultural background versus more interdependent. No, independent.
Yeah, interdependent.
Yeah. And I think in your study, you compared Germany to the US being more independent than Germany. I would have thought Germany was quite independent, but in that comparison, Germany was actually then seen as more collectivistic. And then I wondered then, in that case, is that why these German elderly people are not maybe as lonely as, well, I'm not actually sure. I can't compare to another country, but perhaps in other countries. So maybe if we compare to the UK or the US, are their elderly people worse off? But I would say there's a lot of people here living in nursing homes. And it did say that those living in nursing homes were more lonely, which is interesting because there you have potentially more social contacts. But then you have to wonder, why are you in the nursing home? Probably it's not, no one really chooses to go to a nursing home. They probably don't have maybe a lot of contact to their social circle, their original social circle, shall I say, or family anymore. So again, it goes back to this whole thing, the social isolation, which is having few social contacts, versus loneliness, which is this subjective feeling of just being alone. And it's very difficult because you might look at someone in a nursing home who objectively has a lot of social contact, but subjectively their subjective experience of it is a more negative experience.
I like the way you look at this. I think this is a great observation. And I think that's exactly what that is, right? So it really matters, the quality of the interaction and this moment of, when it comes to our social lives, I think we also value, we value the meaning in the significance of the relationships that we have. And there might also be an element of control and choice. And when you're in a nursing home, you don't get to decide who's with you. And the people who take care of you, like, there's probably also great variation in the extent to which they provide quality social interaction for you. But you definitely don't get a lot of choice in who's with you. And I think that might be, for some people, really palpable, the fact that they are they can't control who they're with. And we all know that, like, sometimes we'd probably rather be by ourselves than with people we don't want to be with. And I think that absolutely reaches across the ages. But what you're saying, it reminded me of another research project that we've done recently that I think is really interesting in that respect. And that is, I've talked about the self-concept, or some people call it self-construal, but this idea of individualism and collectivism in the culture that translate into how we define our sense of self and what's important to us. And we found that as people, and this is in the US, as people get older, their self-control becomes increasingly interdependent. And that makes a lot of intuitive sense, because as we move through life, it's highly beneficial, especially in an individualistic society, to become quite independent in your 20s and 30s. And then as you start having a family or having relationships that are longer term and building your life in that way, and as you start getting older, it becomes more important to be there for others. But then you also get into a stage where you realize you will need others to support you as you're getting older. So that is an interesting natural, development. But it is really interesting to see how, what implication does that have? Does that mean that people might even have a greater need for meaningful connection? We know that people, as they get older, become more selective on whom they spend time with. As time becomes a more limited resource, we're more selective on whom we want to spend that time with. But then also, to what extent does that mean that people are even more in need of having these meaningful connections, and so are feeling the loss of those connections more deeply? So I think that's it's really interesting to put that all in context, and we realize culture plays a large role in this, and also the general situation. I think it's really interesting that you see that in Germany, that you found this number of only 12% actually experiencing loneliness at that age, which I think that's a number that should give one hope. I think that's probably there's something that's working, but then seeing that the people who are in nursing homes are actually not represented as much in that number as one would think is also a really interesting observation. Yeah.
I think I just find it very interesting, because obviously we have an aging population. As you mentioned, I think this whole collectivistic cultural, what we used to have, how families used to stay together as they were aging, that's also, it's breaking down. And then it does then beg the question, what will become of everyone maybe going into a nursing home? And I don't know if you've ever read the book, Being Immortal by Atul Gawande. I found it really interesting. I can't remember all of it now, but he does talk about aging populations and nursing homes. And I think it was him or someone else did an experiment of having animals in a nursing home, the residents, they had to take care of a bird, for example, or I think sometimes they had a dog, a shared dog, and just everyone was so much happier for it. And I think it was this sense of purpose. And maybe that goes back to then it might not be a human relationship, but it's maybe a relationship you have chosen, you have a bit of autonomy over. Maybe. And then he pointed out that unfortunately, though, with increasing regulations and such around nursing homes, difficult to get animals into nursing homes. Yeah. It's just all a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it? Yeah,
that is fascinating. I love studies like that, or generally thinking outside of what we think of as the limitations of taking care of people getting older and needing more supports, but that part of that support is also some of our basic psychological needs that need to be met. It's not just being fed and being in a clean environment and having our medical cares needs taken care of, but also having this connection and a sense of there's studies from the 70s that show that giving people more control over their everyday life and the way that they decorate their rooms in a nursing home increase life expectancy, right? So those things make us so aware that it's not just the physical things, it's not just the physical needs, there's so much more that goes into it. And I love the title of the book that you've mentioned. I want to see if I can find it, but the title of this, Being Mortal, makes me so aware of another really fascinating phenomenon in our Western culture. I think particularly is this, that we don't think of ourselves as aging. We don't necessarily think of ourselves as being part of that group, but we already are. The moment, we enter this life, we are on the path, and not being able to see that the decisions we make about how people get to spend their later years and how we invest in that, not seeing that as our problem, seems almost, it's a paradox.
Yeah.
That we don't see ourselves in that group, even though we are, and we will eventually be, and everybody strives to, have a high life expectancy, but that means that we will eventually need support.
Yeah. Yeah, I work in the area of geriatrics, so I feel like I am confronted by this really a lot, as in at 80 and 90 years old, people don't want to be swallowing pills. Okay, people don't want to be swallowing pills anyway, but especially at that age. And then you wonder, is like, what can I actually do to help you? Like, how can I help you live? It is the UN decade of healthy aging. Like, how can I help you age well and live a life that is meaningful to you? Yes, I can give you your statin and your ACE inhibitor and whatever other medication, and I can control your blood pressure. But, I think these things, loneliness or being able to decorate your own room in the nursing home, I think these are the things people are more thankful for. Well, I suppose it's more maybe visible and visceral to them themselves. They can't see their blood pressure. They can't see that it's maybe slowly damaging their heart. So yes, I probably still am helping in some way, but it would be nice, I suppose, that if there was a more societal limelight flashed upon this.
Yeah, greater recognition of how these things actually work together.
Yeah.
And, I think I'm hopeful, because I think there is more and more of an awareness. And then eventually that means that the resources ideally will also represent that connection, and how they are being, led into making sure that people have a meaningful social life. And that we also feel comfortable with how people get to experience older age in our society.
Yeah.
And it's not something that we're trying to not think about, because we know we'll be there too.
I'm hopeful for AI, actually, perhaps in the context of the nursing homes, where there is so much, maybe so much loneliness, that it sounds a bit like, iRobot, futuristic, but I do think there will be AI that they can make look human in some respects, or at least somewhat semi-human, who will be able to sit with maybe a patient with dementia who, it's can be quite taxing, I think, for maybe relatives to sit there and maybe listen to repeated conversations. Like, it's maybe the same conversation over and over. And I think we are all human. We're all going to get a bit annoyed by that sometimes. Or, I mean, in the context of the hospital, it's actually quite nice. We have a lot of, students, or just people who help out, volunteers, or, young people trying to get experience. And they're often the ones I go sit and talk to her for a little while. And it's really sweet to watch. But then, an AI who could potentially be programmed to react in an age appropriate way, as in maybe they'll be programmed with what would be relevant for our population here in Germany would be a lot around World War II, for example, still. They will remember that now in their older age, or how it was post-war and whatever. And I can't relate to that. I can't have a meaningful conversation with somebody about that. But maybe an AI who's been programmed can be like, oh yeah, I remember how it was then with, because they would have eaten certain things back then, maybe certain brands that don't exist anymore, and they could talk about it, or the dance, or I don't know what German people used to do back in the, the 40s or 30s or 40s. But I am hopeful. Watch this space. AI. I don't know. Maybe I'm a bit crazy, but I think it could be.
I hear you. I think there is, and that's how we need to see where is there potential, and where can this be used as a resource. I think my only caveat would be, as we're trying to think about meaningful interactions, and as we're trying to put ourselves into what would we want for ourselves, which I think we don't do enough. Is that really what we would like when we see ourselves at that stage, even though we might not be able to discern if this is a robot or a real person. That's just what I would like put as a caveat, because I do think there is a lot of possibility and there's a lot of potential and we should use it. And at the same time, also kind of like being aware of we won't be able to solve it all with EI and, like robots, just as and I think that's why it's so important that we keep ourselves in like being able to empathize what it would be and keeping that perspective. But yeah, like I think there's a lot that could probably benefit from using resources that we haven't thought of yet, and using AI in that respect.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I'm out of questions. Is there anything else I might not have asked that you wanted to share? One of your questions reminded me of the study that we did with the self-control. And one of the things that I'd like to share is, because I found that a fascinating result, is that when we found these correlations between self-control and getting older and people becoming more collectivistic or more interdependent in how they thought about themselves, and that was associated with altruism and like altruistic tendencies, being more willing to help, we wanted to study that in a more experimental way. And so we had young students in their like early 20s participate in a study where they took a photo of themselves, and that was put into an age morphing software. And so they looked at themselves 20 years aged. So not as like older people, but, just like maybe in their 40s, but visibly aged. And when we did that, we found very similar outcomes on what we were interested in terms of altruism. So we realized that there seems to be something about projecting yourself into an older age and becoming more other-oriented to some extent. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think that's also, there's something in there where we can, sometimes maybe getting people to imagine themselves at an older age. Yeah.
Maybe make better decisions of how we can help people navigate their world.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think that steps into my world a bit, where we have, like, oh gosh, now I'm lost for the English word now. Patientenverfügung. Like, what would you like if this, that, and the other happened? And a lot of people don't have them. A lot of people do, but don't know what's in it. Or, so it's like this piece of paper they filled out once, but not really thought about. And no one really wants to think about it, which is it's a shame, because it doesn't have to be negative and sad, like to think about it. I mean, the surest thing in life is death. I mean, that's coming for everyone. So it doesn't have to be a negative thing to think about it. Like, what would you like? It just makes it easier for family, for your healthcare providers to provide you with what you want or think you want, because at the end of the day, no one knows for sure. You've never been in that experience or in that situation. You're writing a document based on an imagined situation, but I think it's no harm if people give it a bit more of a thought, or as you said, like imagine yourself a bit older. And I think if there is a way to get people to think about these things at an earlier stage and seeing the value in being prepared and having thought about it. It also, we know that when something that is in the future that is daunting or threatening, when we allow ourselves to think it through and, make a list or have a plan, it's not as daunting anymore. It's not as threatening anymore, because we get a sense of control. And of course we can't control death, but we can control how we approach it and, what leads up to it. And I think giving people a chance to get there, or finding ways to get people to think about these things earlier, especially also with their loved ones and with their families. I recently had a chance to attend this consortium on aging here at Northwestern University in Chicago, and there was one speaker who said
I think this person was an attorney, and they were talking about getting these documents ready and the power of attorney and getting things ready. And they said, it's like you have to look at it as a gift to your loved ones, or just imagine like what they'll be going through when they're grieving you, and how much easier you can make their lives if they have this information and they don't have to, like, in addition to mourning, having to like solve all of these puzzles to.
That's a beautiful way
make these decisions.
This person put that. That's really nice. Nice way to think about it, because I mean, it is something that people associate negativity with, but that's like a very beautiful, positive thing to associate with it. Thank you for sharing that.
Happy to.
Well, I think that wraps us up. Thank you so much for such a beautiful conversation. I think this is a really important topic that we discussed, and hopefully for our listeners, they might think about, when they're screening for cardiovascular risk factors, you might think about screening for social isolation or loneliness, and maybe pointing your patient in the right direction. And maybe that will help with their risk of dementia, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. Thank you so much for your research and for sharing it with us. Really interesting and really great to see from the social psychology point of view, and these, like, as you say, very small exclusion scenarios, how that potentially can link to the greater health of a person. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. A really interesting conversation.
Vielen Dank, dass du heute wieder zugehört hast und unser Gast gewesen bist. Wir hoffen sehr, dass dir dieser Beitrag gefallen hat und du etwas für deinen klinischen Alltag mitnehmen konntest. Wenn dem so sein sollte, dann freuen wir uns sehr über eine positive Bewertung bei Apple Podcasts. Falls du Lust hast mitzumachen und es einen Themenbereich gibt, in dem du dich besonders gut auskennst, dann melde dich doch gerne unter kontakt@klinisch-relevant.de. Gleiches gilt, wenn du Themenvorschläge oder konstruktive Kritik für uns hast. An dieser Stelle auch der Hinweis auf unseren Newsletter, den du unter www.klinisch-relevant.de abonnieren kannst und der dich immer auf dem Laufenden hält. Wenn du dich für unseren Newsletter einträgst, bekommst du einen 5-Euro-Gutschein, mit dem du in unserer Fortbildungsakademie einkaufen kannst. Wir wünschen dir jetzt bis zum nächsten Mal eine gute Zeit und freuen uns, wenn du bald wieder einschaltest. Pass auf dich auf, bleib gesund. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao.